All right, so good afternoon, ladies and jelly spoons. How's it going? Good? Ready for the weekend? All right. So yeah, I just want to remind you, you're welcome to join me for office hours right out there on Monday, 5 to 6 p.m. All Mondays, 5 to 6 p.m. right there. And we can hang out and talk about whatever you want. And, um, and please send me emails. I don't care how long they are. Whatever you want to ask, send me an email. It's on your syllabus. And it should be on Blackboard too. So guys, according to the syllabus, today is the day we're supposed to be finishing up with the topic of God and religion. And that is my objective today. We have to get through 4 more arguments by St. Thomas Aquinas, which are cosmological arguments. Then we have to get through one big type of argument by William Paley. It's called the teleological argument. And then we're going to conclude not so much by studying whether or not God exists. Instead, we're going to look at a philosopher who argues not for the existence of God, but for the idea that God is perfect, and that implies that whatever he does is perfect, and therefore that this very world we're in is in some sense perfect. But obviously that's going to create a problem, right? You can already see the problem. If you call this world perfect, supremely good, then there's another feature of our experience of the world which is going to be in tension with his claim that not only God is perfect, but that this world is the best of all possible worlds. It's a very short piece in your text, and we're going to go through it. But we only have an hour and 20 minutes, so let's just dive right into it. Last class, we were looking at a group of arguments by St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas is offering a different kind of argument from what we saw with Anselm. Anselm was arguing basically that we can offer an ontological argument for the existence of God. And by ontological, he simply means if we get the concept of the kind of being that God is correct, then that will have implications, deductively valid implications, deductively sound implications for God's status as real and existent, all right? So we talked about that, and last class we talked about the first argument that Aquinas offers for the existence of God. That's a classically cosmological argument. Now remember, as we pointed out last time, the ontological argument has a very interesting feature. It's what we might call a purely logical argument. Why do we call it purely logical? You don't have to observe the world or anything in the world. You don't have to observe anything at all to reach the conclusion that God exists. The work, the intellectual labor that you have to do is figuring out just what the concept and definition of God is. That's where the labor is. That's where the work is. And it's Anselm's conviction that if you do that properly, you will see that perfection is one of the qualities of God. In fact, it's the essential quality. And that to exist is a kind of perfection. So if God is truly the greatest conceivable being, and he has all possible perfections, then how could he miss the perfection of being real or existing, all right? That was Anselm's type of argument. It's a purely logical argument. The next 2 arguments we're going to cover today are not like that. These other arguments are empirical arguments. When we say something is empirical, it means it depends in some sense upon your experiences. Yes, you can conclude that God exists for Aquinas and for Paley, who we're going to look at later. You can reach that conclusion that God exists, but for them, you can't reach that conclusion purely logically or purely by starting with the right concept and looking at its implications. Instead, you have to observe the world, and then you have to observe the features of the world and look at the metaphysical implications of those features. So the last argument that we saw, which is the first one that he offers, it's a cosmological argument. When we say cosmological rather than ontological, what we mean is when you study the being of God, that's ontology, that's ontological. But if you study the world, that's the cosmos. The Greek word cosmos means universe or world. So we're going to conclude that God exists by studying the world. But there's a particular feature in the world that's going to be the foundation on which we're going to build this argument for the existence of God. And that first argument, the feature was change. Remember that? We see in the world this thing called change. It's a feature of the world. But if you reflect a bit deeply, this is the kind of feature that cannot be self-supporting, according to Aquinas. Because you might say, okay, yeah, sure, there's change in the world, but that doesn't imply anything outside of the world or beyond the world. It doesn't imply anything metaphysical. The world is just full of change. And it could be self-supporting change. It could be the world causing changes in itself, so it's self-sufficient, and that doesn't suggest anything outside. But Aquinas is borrowing some concepts from Aristotle. So Aquinas is writing around 1300 AD. Aristotle is from like 300 BC. Aquinas really spent a lot of time studying Aristotle. And in fact, Aquinas, even today, is the official philosopher of the Catholic Church. What this means is if you are a Catholic and you're teaching in a Catholic university, you must, if you're to remain employed by the Catholic Church, you must teach that Thomas Aquinas is the real or the best philosopher, and you must teach his philosophy as if it is the official dogma or the official philosophy of the Catholic Church. So Aquinas established that reputation because what he was doing is he was taking Aristotle, who's a pagan before Christ, and he was taking the scripture and he was trying to make them consistent with one another. Because he saw that scripture is divine and it's very inspired, it's revelation. But if you're going to spread the religion, you need something pagan, you need something reason-based, rational and philosophical, so that you can convince the people who aren't believers and who don't have faith, you can convince them using reason rather than using faith. All right? So Aquinas comes up with these arguments, and he borrows concepts from Aristotle. Last class, when we talked about change, Aquinas articulated the possibility of change in terms of two concepts. He said every change is a dynamic relation between two states, two metaphysical states, the state of potentiality and the state of actuality. So what he's basically saying is this: if there's change in our world, then that means that there must be this world, that has change in it, there must be states in this world that are purely potential states. Do you see that? Because the change has to operate on something and take it from one state to another. But the earlier state, before the change, that is a change that, according to Aristotle, that state is a potential state, meaning it has the potential to become something else. Do you see that? And then after the change, that's another state. After the change, it's gone from being pure potential to being actual. And so what he argues is that if you understand this dynamic properly, you will understand that all change in the world basically amounts to changes from potential states to actual states. But there's a little logic here. The same thing cannot be in both of those states at the same time. You cannot be in a potential state of hotness and also an actual state of hotness. you are in either one or the other. Do you see that? You cannot be in a potential state of motion and an actual state of motion. You can only be in one or the other, before the change or after. Now, what are the implications of this? Well, the people who say that the world is self-sufficient and that the world changes itself, he's going to trap them by saying, look, if you say that the world's changes are self-initiated, what you are saying is that the things that are changing in the world are in both states at the same time. Do you see that? Because if it's causing itself to change, well, before the change, it must be in the potential state, right? But if it's causing itself to change, then at the same time, it's got to be actual to cause that change. But that's a contradiction. You can't have that be the case. That is a contradiction. So, yes, there are changes in our world from potential to actual, but they can't be self-initiated by the thing that's changing. So logically, you eliminate that possibility, and what other possibility are you left with? Well, all the changes in the world are caused by other things. So all the changes from potential to actual are caused by other things that are in actual states that are doing the converting. And you get a series. The world is full of change, and there are a series of changes, and there are a series of actual to potential changes. And that series goes on for quite an amount. Our world is very vast. We've got solar systems and galaxies. There are changes that span across different, astronomical units, light years across the galaxies and across the universe. So there's a lot of change, and there are a lot of series of changes. But according to Aquinas, the first logical hoop we needed to get through is figuring out the dynamic between potential and actual. And then the second loop we've got to figure out, how long can this series go on? His logic is this. Yes, there are changes in the world, and they are caused by other parts of a series of changes, but that series cannot go on infinitely forever. Now, what's his logic? His logic is, if it went on forever, that is, if it were truly going on till infinity, and there was no beginning member, well, if there's no beginning to something, then his logic is that it would never get started. Does that make sense? If there's no beginning, if it truly goes on forever, infinitely into the past, then how is it going to get started? Because there's no initiator. So his logic is, once again, let's eliminate that possibility that it goes on forever. And if it doesn't go on forever, then what's the other alternative? There are only two alternatives. It either goes on forever or what? It doesn't go on forever, which implies there's a starting point. So that means that there's one thing that starts all the changes in the universe, but that itself doesn't get started by anything else. And what do you think that thing is, according to Aquinas? Yeah, that is God. That's one interpretation of what God is. So that's a very different argument from the ontological argument. Now, I'm going to expose you to something else that's very similar. It's analogous in certain respects. The key moves are the same, but the logic is slightly different. Once again, you start with an observation of the world. This is another type of cosmological argument I'm about to share with you. You start with an observation of the world, and it's related to change, but it's a different articulation of the same thing. What you say is this. In the world, we have different effects that have different causes. So causation or causality is a feature of the world. We see one thing causing another thing, causes and effects. Now, once again, he's going to address this issue of, well, what if the causes in the world are self-sufficient? What if they start themselves? He's not going to talk about potential versus actual here, but he does have a response, and it's similar. If something in the world causes itself, Now, he's going to say, just like there was a contradiction in saying that something can be both potential and actual at the same time, he's going to say that phrase causes itself, if you really think about it, is contradictory. Why? Before something exists, it doesn't exist, right? And then once it does exist, then it can be what it is, and it can cause other things. But it can't cause anything else until it itself has been caused. Do you see that? Now, if you say something causes itself, what you're basically saying is before it even existed, it caused itself to exist. Now, do you see the contradiction? That logically, that can't happen. You would be saying that this thing is logically prior to itself. Causing yourself when you don't even exist yet is magic. That's not how the world works. So, with that logic in place, now he moves on and he makes the same moves he did in the earlier argument. He says, okay, there are a series of causes, right? One thing causes another. You have chains of effects. There are long series and sequences of effects coming from different causes. But just like in the first argument, it can't go on forever. Otherwise, the whole thing would never get started. So there must be one cause to the entire world and all the effects we see in the world. And the name we give to that is God. So these are the classical cosmological arguments. What you're doing is you're saying, look, from the world and its features, the status of the world as something that exists somehow implies that some other thing must also exist that either causes all of the effects in the world or at least causes the changes in the world. You see that? Do you guys have any criticisms or anything? Any, like, is this bad logic, or do you see any of the moves he makes here as kind of like suspect? You know how we looked at fallacies and things like that, right? Appeal to the masses, begging the question, attacking the person, appeal to tradition. Is there anything a bit spooky or fallacious here? Something that you snuck it in, but if you don't notice it, it's too subtle. Go ahead.
The only thing that maybe doesn't make sense to me, but saying that something can't change itself, I don't think that's always true.
Okay, let's get into the details because I really like taking questions from students. So let's get into it. Now, he has to create a reason why God must exist. The people who are going to argue against him are going to say, the reason you're trying to give us for God existing is not necessary because, as you suggest, some people are going to say, change isn't that mysterious. It's just natural. It's a part of nature, a part of the world. Now, he's going to use these technical terms that he gets from Aristotle. He's going to say every change is a change from one type of state to another, from potential to actual. Now, he's going to say that if you say that the world's changes are all self-initiated, that's committing you to the idea that the same thing can go from potential to actual, and at the same time, when it started off being potential, it was already actual, because the only way it could have changed from potential to actual is if it was acted on by something that was actual. So if something is cold, it's potentially hot, right? So only something actually hot could act on something potentially hot to make it do the transition to something actually hot. You see that?
I think the logic behind it, I guess I'm saying it says the world can't change itself, but there's so many moving parts in the world that they can affect each other. That's the part that lost me. Not, I understand the potential in the actual state. I guess if something as big as the world, I was thinking there'd be more than one thing going on, and you're just identifying it as the world in general.
Okay, good. So let me see if I think you're onto something. So what you're saying is the world is so vast, and there's so much changes, and there's so many things in the world that before we point to God, there's so many alternatives within the world. So yes, a thing can't cause itself to change. You agree with that. But you're saying, what about the other candidates within the world? And what about the series never leaving the world, but just curving within the world forever? Something like that, right? I think that's a really, really good response. Go ahead.
Did anyone ever say like counter argument that there could be like a third state of like in the process of changing?
Okay, very good. So okay. So his view is a bit static, right? He's saying there's one state that's static. It is pure potential. And there's another state that's pure actual. What you're suggesting is there's a third state in between that's kind of like dynamic. It's not static. It's a process, right? It's not a state. It's a process of moving from one to another. Very good. Yeah, I think that's really good. So with that, you could challenge his dichotomy between potential and actual. That you could challenge that. But is there anything else that you're trying to use that adjustment for? Like if you introduce the third state, now how are you going to challenge? How is that going to impact eventually the existence or non-existence of God? Do you have any idea how it might influence that?
I think at first it would challenge the statement that things can't change itself, because potentially if there was the middle state or dynamic, you could argue that like the potential could put itself into the changing dynamic, which leads to the other state. So it's not potential or actual.
You know what? That's brilliant. Yeah. Okay. Let me tell you something. So we didn't talk about this a lot in this class, and eventually I want to share with you a nice little outline about the history of philosophy. We'll get to it. But yeah, there's a philosopher called Heraclitus, and he said the world as we see it is an illusion. Our senses are deceiving us. And when he said that, what he went on to say is kind of like what you said. He said, there are no states that are static in the world. Things appear as if they're static, as if they are in states of being. But what he said is, if you really do logic and you think about it, that appearance of things being permanent or static is just an illusion from your senses. And what the world is actually like is what you said. It's in a process. Everything is changing and nothing is stable. Everything is in flux. So if you had that metaphysics about the world, then you would be able to get out of the problem that Aquinas is trying to create. And you could say, yeah, transitions from one state to another are actually completely natural. There's nothing supernatural or divine necessary for them. And all the transitions we see in the world are kind of self-sufficient because it actually blurs the distinction between one state and another. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, read about Heraclitus. You might find some inspiration there. Go ahead.
I think one of the problems I have with that incident being self-inspired or self-started is that it kind of an argument against free will in a way. Especially if you like, I don't know, some eternal thing. So I know it's kind of like the big thing is that, like, I don't know, Christianity calls it that God granted free will.
Yeah. Right, yeah, okay. Good. You're connecting different parts of the course. Good. Yeah. So, right. So we are the kinds of beings that can make moral choices and moral decisions. That implies that we are responsible for our actions. But if we're responsible for our actions, then the way we call that is free will, meaning it's our own will. We determine ourselves freely, free of any external influence. So the opposite of free will would be determinism. If we lived in a world where everything in the world were fully determined, then everything we do we would never be responsible for it. It would be like you standing in line and then someone pushes you and you knock into the person in front of you. Are you responsible for that? No, it was determined. Someone pushed you. That was determined. But if you're standing in line and it's true that you have something like free will and your neurons or whatever don't determine what you do, then yeah, there's this myth of freedom. Like you can actually shove someone and then you're responsible for it and you can get punished for it or whatever. So what you're saying is that the logic he's using to undermine self-change is also the same kind of logic that we need to support free will. That's what you're saying, right? And so now that's a problem, because if I can't change myself, if I can only be changed by something outside of me, then that means determinism is true. I am fully determined. There is no such thing as free will. And theoretically, that's problematic, but also just practically. That means institutions like criminal justice are unfair. No one is really responsible for what they do. So that's a brilliant point. I really like it. And it's connecting different parts of the class. All right, guys. I just got to expose you to this stuff so that you can, I like what you're doing. You're thinking about it deeper and not just accepting it. But yeah, that's what class is for. I expose it to you. And then we try to dig deep and see, whether this stuff makes sense. All right, so the classical cosmological arguments are those two: the feature of change in the world and the feature of causation in the world. Now, he has three more arguments. They aren't classically cosmological, but we're going to go through them briefly anyway, just so you have a flavor of why Aquinas is such an authority within the Catholic Church, and even within philosophy in general. His arguments might not be perfect, and they might be better than Anselm, but I think it's worthwhile thinking them through. And if they're flawed, let's really find out what those flaws are. His third argument is what we call the argument from possibility and necessity. Okay, this one is interesting. What he says is, there's a feature of the world in which everything in the world has a kind of possibility of not existing. So, in most general terms, things come into existence and they go out. Just like we come into existence and we go out. Everything that's made by man, it comes into existence for a while, and then eventually it decays or it gets destroyed, disassembled, combustion, whatever. Now, he literally says everything in the world has this status of instability and possibility for non-existence. And what he says, he makes a very interesting logical move. Look at what he's going to do. He's going to say, if something has the possibility of not existing, then at some point in its actual history, it must have not actually existed. Very interesting move. It's almost like he's saying, if you have the possibility of not existing, that implies something metaphysical about you, like a defect, like a deficiency. If we can conceptually see that you have the possibility of not existing, then according to him, that implies that there is some point in time in which you actually did not exist. And I guess the reasoning is something like this. Well, if you have the possibility of existing, then you clearly can't exist for eternity. Otherwise, there would be no example to demonstrate that you do exist forever. Do you see that? So the possibility that you can decay or not exist, for him, implies that at some moment in time, throughout eternity, there must be some time when you actually did not exist. So that's the first logical move that he makes. And then the second one is crazier. Now he says, so since everything in the world has this possibility of not existing, then there must have been some actual moment in history throughout eternity where nothing existed. So in other words, all the different things that cannot exist, there must be some point in history in which they actually overlapped in their non-existence. But he says that's impossible. And you know why it's impossible? Because if there were a moment in time where the non-existence of everything coincided and overlapped, what exists at that moment in time? Think about it. The non-existence of everything in the world coinciding and overlapping at the same time. What is true of the status of being or reality at that moment? What exists at that time? There's a word for it. Nothing, right? If everything is decaying and everything is in a state of non-existence at the same time, then if you add everything up and you make a total, the total number of things that exist at that moment is zero. Nothing. But guys, that's impossible. It's impossible that there was ever a moment where absolutely everything did not exist. Why? There's something, right? You see, there's something, and something cannot come from what? That's his logic, right? Since something cannot come from nothing, and we're surrounded by things that are not eternal, things that don't exist forever, he's going to say there must be some other thing than what we find in the world that doesn't have the feature that these things in the world has where they can go out of existence. There must be some one thing that can never go out of existence. A necessary being. And you know what that is, right? That's his logic. He's eliminating the possibility that there was a time when there was nothing. Because if we admit that, kind of like before the Big Bang, one of the biggest problems for scientists is to say, okay, if there was nothing before the Big Bang, then how did it all get started? What kind of spark? How could it even, what could motivate the change? What kind of force could there be? No, it just gets crazy. It's hard to imagine if before the Big Bang, we are committed to the idea that there truly was nothing and that something came out of nothing, we have a huge problem here. And it's a logical problem. How can you get something from nothing? The categories of nothingness and something are so remote from one another that it's hard to imagine the transition. Now, there are branches of physics which seem to suggest that nothing is very unstable. There's quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics studies the universe on very, very small scales of space and very, very small scales of time. And there was a philosopher and a scientist known as Heisenberg. And he had the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which basically amounted to the idea that, look, if you go to the smallest possible scale that our instruments can observe, then the position and the momentum of any particle in that space cannot be determined at the same time. So you can either know its position, or you can't know its momentum, or you can know its momentum, but you can't know its position. What that basically suggested about the world at the microscopic level is that it's very unstable. It's so unstable that you literally have electrons and other particles jumping out of nothing, existing for a while, and then jumping back into nothing. So modern physics does seem to suggest a kind of something coming out of nothing. All right, so I don't think modern physics explains how that's possible. It just observes that that is a feature of the world. But that's very different from explaining. Nevertheless, I think Aquinas is an interesting thinker here. Since something can't come from nothing according to him, let's assume that that's true and that modern physics is wrong or irrelevant. If something can't come from nothing, then all of this must have come from something that doesn't go in and out of existence, something that's always in existence, and that would be God. He would be the animator and the administrator of all things. He regulates when they come into existence. He regulates when they come out. And that's one more argument for the existence of God. Now, I just want to point out, there's a kind of hierarchy or order here that you can't appreciate until you go deep into philosophy. This concept of perfection, right? We have a rank. We have things that are impossible. They can't even exist at all. And those are the kinds of things that their very existence involves a kind of contradiction, or you know what I mean? Like, I guess a square circle, or, you know, something like that, right? Something that you can't even conceive, or that involves a direct contradiction. So at the lowest level of imperfection, we have impossible things. I don't know, is a unicorn impossible? I guess it depends on certain assumptions you might make about physics and biology. Maybe a unicorn is impossible, I don't know. But the category of things that cannot exist at all, that's a kind of imperfection. Now above that, above the impossible category is a category of possible things. If you think about it carefully, just to be possible is a kind of perfection. You have the possibility of existing. That's something positive. You see that? Impossibility is purely negative. You cannot exist. But possibility is positive. Under the right conditions, you might exist. And then above possibility, we have, above possibility, we have contingency. Contingency is something like this. If certain conditions are met, then this thing will happen. So we have impossibility, then possibility is more perfect than impossibility, then even more perfect than possibility is contingency. Like there are actual conditions that if they're met, this thing will happen. So the existence of that thing depends on those conditions. All right? Now above contingency is a higher type of perfection, which you might call actuality. There are actual things that exist. If something is actual, then obviously it's not impossible, and obviously it is possible. But if it's actual, it's even more perfect than something being possible. It's real, it's actual. And now, what is actuality? That's an interesting question. Does it mean you can observe it? All actual things can be observed, maybe. Now, if you know it's actual in some other way than observing it, that's interesting. How would you figure out something is actual without observing it? I guess we've never seen an electron, right? An electron is kind of like a theoretical entity, but it plays a very interesting role in chemistry, right? If you hypothesize the electron, then you can make sense of chemical reactions, oxidation, chemical bonding, all of that, right? Ionic bonds, covalent bonds. So you might say you can know something is actual without necessarily observing it. And the reason you know it's actual is because of, remember what we talked about last time, induction? That was the third category of induction. Remember that was inference to the best explanation, abduction, or what we called hypothetical induction. When you have a phenomenon and you really brainstorm about what the best explanation is for it, if you come across a hypothesis that makes sense of all the data more elegantly than any other candidate, then probably that's the right answer. So if you guess that there's this thing called an electron that has a certain mass and a certain charge and all that, and it's in certain shells orbiting the nucleus, and there's all this stuff going on in bonding and in releasing frequencies of radiation and light and all that, the photoelectric effect. If your hypothesis of the electron makes sense of all that, maybe that's another way of talking about something being actual. But it's probabilistic, right? It's not like deduction, where you actually know. And then, guys, there's a level of perfection even above actuality. Because remember, an actual thing might be actual right now, but what about tomorrow? What about the day before? So what do you think is the name for something that's even superior to being actual? It's something that's what? Yes, certain. There's a word that he uses. It's certainty, you're right, but certainty is more epistemic. Think about a metaphysical word.
I said eternal.
It's eternal, yes, you're expressing it in terms of time. Something eternal is something that never changes, never goes out of existence. His word for it is it's something necessary. When something is necessary, that means that it can't be other than how it is. Do you see that? Necessity. If something is necessary, that's a higher perfection than actuality. So what is God to Aquinas and other philosophers? Well, he's got the perfection of necessity. We are imperfect beings. We can go in and out of existence. Right now we're actual, but we won't always be actual. Depends on whether or not you believe we have a soul. If we have a soul, then the soul is necessary, but this body is not. This body is actual, but like Aquinas points out, it's one of those things that comes in and out of existence. Now, a necessary being has a higher metaphysical status than all the other categories. That's the type of thing that is self-sufficient in a certain sense. It's a substance, right? And that's some deep stuff. Yeah. A necessary being, a being that doesn't change, and a being that has to exist, has no option but to exist. So one consequence is that it's eternal, right? Since it's always in existence, it exists forever, so it's eternal. And another consequence is that you are always certain of its existence. You don't have to double check. The fact that you know that it's a necessary being means, as a matter of epistemology, it has the highest rank in epistemology too. You know for a fact that it exists because of its nature. All right? All right, guys, we're making progress. Next, there are two more that are really short. Aquinas says, if you look at the world, you see that it has certain perfections. Some things are more beautiful than others. Other things seem to be more good than others. Others seem more real than others. So that's a feature of the world, that it has perfections like beauty and goodness and truth and reality. All right? Now, he makes a very interesting logical move. He says, and he's following Aristotle here, he says, wherever there is a kind of quality or perfection, that always implies some sort of distribution. So wherever you locate some quality, especially a perfection, then that has implications that are distributive. In other words, wherever there's a distribution, there's like a distributor. Do you see that? So he'll say something like this: wherever there are hot things in the world, they must be getting their hotness from some source, right? And that makes a little bit of sense, right? A sunny day has lots of hot things that are laying in the sun. Where are they getting their hotness from? They're getting it from the sun, right? So he's making an analogy, kind of like wherever there's hotness, there must be something that's maximally hot that's distributing its qualities onto these less perfect but hot things. So he's building an analogy between that, and he's just saying, look, wherever there is perfection in the world, there must be distribution. Just like the sun gives us so much of our energy that we use in life and biology. So if you expand the analogy a bit bigger, wherever there is perfection in the world, that is being distributed from some source that has the maximum possible perfection. And then as the perfection is distributed here, it gets, more diluted, you know what I mean? And so we have less relative amounts of perfection, but the absolute highest amount of perfection is in the source. And what's the name of that source? You know, right? It's God. All right. And then we have a last argument. which is something like this. In nature, we don't tend to find each individual thing having a mind or a consciousness of its own. There are lots of inanimate things, according to him, that do not have minds of their own, yet they behave as if they are directed by an intelligence or a consciousness. So I think it's not a very hard thing. It's something as simple as gravity, right? Gravity is a kind of mental quality, if you really think about it, because what you're saying is when you lift up the chair and you let it go, there's a direction. I don't know if you've heard this term in physics, there's scalar qualities and vector qualities. Scalar qualities are things like mass. They're just pure quantities. But vector qualities are, in addition to that quantitative aspect, there's a direction, right? So that directedness, the very fact that there's a directedness for someone like Aquinas and definitely for Aristotle, that is animation. And an animal, according to the strict use of the word, is not necessarily a biological creature. An animal is anything that animates. And what we call forces are very mysterious if you really think about them from a physical point of view. Electromagnetism, gravity, things like that. You take two magnets and they either repel each other or attract each other. If you really think about what it is to be a mind, for someone like Aristotle, for someone like Aquinas, and even other philosophers, that is evidence of mind. Now, it might not be an individual mind. He might not say that that particular magnet or this chair has a mind, but he says even inanimate things show this vector quality, kind of like having almost like a purpose, but you don't have to say purpose. It's not necessarily purpose. It can be something like direction. You know, purpose is a bit strong, but things in the world seem to be animated and they seem to be directed. Now, with this direction, he just can't see how there can be direction without a mind or an intelligence or a consciousness doing the directing. It would be almost like going to an opera and seeing an orchestra with no one orchestrating. He just can't believe that's possible. Whatever forces are animating our world, they are mental in character. Magnetism, electromagnetism, gravity. We take it for granted that they're not because we can express them in Newtonian mechanics, right? So we can write F equals ma, and we just say, oh, you know, F is just a quantity, and you don't think about it. F is just a quantity, M is another quantity, and A is another quantity. And you can observe A and M, and then you infer F, right? M times A gives you F. But what's being left out of that equation, what can't be expressed, is the direction. And direction implies a kind of control or order. I mean, the idea that everything attracts everything else, and on this planet, everything is attracted to the planet, we shouldn't take that too lightly. It's a mystery, but if you take physics without a philosophical spirit, you'll get comfortable with those equations, and then basic mysteries will go past you. In fact, some philosophers say that the mathematical understanding of things like physics is actually a form of mindlessness, like you're not even thinking, because you're just manipulating numbers, you know what I mean? You can get so good at manipulating all those numbers and calculating everything that you just forget to think about one of the most basic qualities of mind. What is a mind? That's our next topic, guys. We're finishing God today, and we're moving on to mind. Well, we're going to find it's a really big mystery about what a mind is. Minds involve things like beliefs, right? Desires, Now, who is to say that that force of gravity acting on this thing isn't a kind of desire? You see that? Aristotle had a very sophisticated physics, but it was different from ours. He said things made out of earth are attracted to the same type of thing. So like attracts like. So he understood what Newton understood, that physical things will be attracted to the earth, but he didn't think it was because of a physical force called gravity. He just said anything made out of earth will be attracted to earth, and so earth-like things are attracted to the earth, but they have a kind of mind. There's desire there. They have a desire to be with their same kind of thing. Similarly, air will go up because it's attracted to the air. So he had a sophisticated understanding of things. I'm not defending him, but that's philosophy, guys. Those are 5 arguments for the existence of God. The first 2 are the classically cosmological ones, and the ontological one is the first one we started with. Now, we're about to head into some pretty interesting territory right now, but I just want to pause for questions and comments. We got 20 minutes. I think we'll be able to finish the whole God stuff today. But you get first priority. But let's talk. Any problems with this stuff? The idea that perfection has to be distributed. In other words, what he's saying is perfection is the type of thing that cannot just be in the world. It's got to have a source. So a hot object lying up there in the sun didn't get hot by itself. It had to get its hotness from somewhere that has much more of the same thing, but just distributes it and dilutes it in the process of distribution. Does that sound like fuzzy logic or what?
Yeah, so it's like different sources. When you say it dilates it, like different source over here, you get less than over here.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean by dilution. In other words, guys, I don't know, what's the best way to explain this? As a wave, have you taken optics? All right. What I'm trying to say is as a ray of light spreads out, the intensity per unit of area decreases. You see why? If you have a beam of light shining out, then if you take a cross section here and then here, there are less rays hitting each area as you go further out. So there's a kind of dilution, right? If you took an object and you put it next to the sun, or even on Venus or Mercury, the number of rays, the intensity of rays per unit area would be very high. So that's the opposite of dilution. That's concentration. Do you see that? So you're closer to the source, so you have more of the qualities of the source at a higher concentration. But the further away you go, the perfections get less. Does that make sense? The further away you are from the source.
So have people ever been like geographical location to determine like how much perfection you get, and like feel like that's not true in every circumstance?
Exactly. I mean, it's analogy. That this is an example of the kind of reasoning we were using. Remember, we talked about analogical induction. He's using an analogy between the sun and some hot object on the surface of the earth. And analogies can be good in some respects. They can reveal certain things, but analogies are not perfect. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that it sounds like a lot of the arguments you're making are kind of, they're kind of repetitions.
Yeah, I think that you're right. The first two are almost the same thing, because causes and effects and changes. Well, if you just say a change is something caused, or a change is the result of a cause, or a change is the same as the effect of a cause, you can condense those into one argument. The second argument is interesting, right? So he's saying it's impossible that there's nothing, and in a world full of decay and imperfection, where things are going in and out of existence, that kind of suggests a kind of nothing, but nothing is impossible. Therefore, there must be a necessary being who has this status of always existing. What do you think about that one? Do you think there's repetition there? That seems pretty original, right?
I think it's analogous just because it's talking about God as like grand initiator.
Grand initiator, yeah.
It's the same, I don't know, it seems the same
Yeah, it causes the necessity of other things. You're right. That's what he says. And then the perfection one, the distribution of qualities, what do you think?
Also kind of got the same way of talking about God being the source of that.
And then the, oh yeah, what about the last one? The one where it's basically the argument from governance. He's basically saying God governs the world, but he doesn't do it in a way that we might recognize always, you know? Something as simple as a magnet attracting another magnet or gravity. That's God directing things. What do you think?
I don't know. I think that in itself, God is a little bit self-serving. It's kind of under contradiction of free will again.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, you don't have free will if God is doing the motivation for you. That's right. Okay. Good job, man. That's good job, Dante. Now let's get into some other type of argument, and let's see what we're working with here. So, guys, we started off with the ontological argument, which is purely logical, and then we saw our first empirical argument. Now we're about to look at a very interesting empirical argument. It's not cosmological. You're not looking at the world as a whole and its features. Now you're looking at a very special, very, very special, very peculiar feature of the world. And this is very debatable because it's going to put us in conflict with Charles Darwin. And you're going to see why. So this philosopher called William Paley, he's going to offer us a teleological argument. Teleology, guys. So the ontological argument is the idea that you can figure out God exists from the claim that being he is. The cosmological argument, you can figure out that God exists from certain features in the world. And the teleological argument is you can figure out God exists from a very special feature in the world. It's almost a metaphysical feature of the world. And here's the thing. He gives you a thought experiment. He says, let's say you go to an island. And on the island, you walk around, and you're just doing your thing, maybe you're Robinson Crusoe or someone like that, and you come across a stone. Just a stone. And then you hear some voice ask you, well, how did that stone get there, or where did it come from? Now, there's something about that stone, we're going to discuss it, but there's something about that stone that I think would imply or would suggest to you that it's not necessarily out of place, you know? It could have been there forever. It's not out of place, there's nothing strange about it. And there's nothing to explain in any deep sense, right? There's nothing to explain. I mean, if it's there, then the waves could have washed it there, an animal could have put it there, and it could be the thing that it is without any deep need for explaining why it is where it is, or why it is what it is, or anything like that. The features that it has do not evoke or provoke the necessity for deep explanation, okay? But now let's switch it up. Take the same scenario. You're on a deserted island. There is no one there, right? And you come across a watch. Okay. You come across a watch. Now, do you think you'll have the same reaction? Just assume you're not a philosopher. You're just a plain, regular person. First of all, you come across a stone. You don't even have much of a reaction. You're just like, it's just a stone. But you walk further along the island, and then you come across a watch. And from a regular layman's perspective, do you think the reaction will be the same in both cases? Okay, now, thank you. Okay, now we have to do some deep thinking. That reaction, even though it's commonsensical, and the layman will have that reaction just like the philosopher, saying exactly why that reaction happens and why it's justified is not as easy as it seems. Because what is it about the watch that at least initially evokes that reaction? Makes you feel like, man, there is something to explain here. Go ahead.
Well, because a rock is a natural thing that would just be on the ground anyway, whereas like a watch is man-made, you know, so it was someone's.
Yes, very good. So this is an uninhabited island. Now, you're walking around with this in the background of your mind. It's uninhabited. It's uninhabited. So what Sarah said makes perfect sense, right? If it's uninhabited, then the kind of things you encounter are kind of configured for you, right? If you're just in a casual walk, you come across a stone, it is unremarkable, right? Given that it's a part of nature. And so whatever nature does in her own little affairs seems sufficient to explain where it is and why it is what it is. But there's something about the watch that's different. In the context of the natural habitat and the natural environment, whatever processes go on in nature, they don't seem sufficient, at least on a first look, to explain how the watch got there without someone putting it there or dropping it there. And that's what I want us to focus on right now. How could a watch like that occur or exist on a completely deserted island that has never been inhabited by anyone? How could that happen? Okay, that's what we're struggling with. And I'm going to give you a leading question. The leading question is, what is it about the watch compared to the stone that makes us think that it can't just be the processes of nature? Something about it that makes us think this thing, like Sarah said, is man-made, and I'm going to use a special word to capture what she said. When we say man-made, the other word for it is artificial. Why is that word important? That word is important because when we say something is artificial, we're implying that it's what? A work of art. You see that? Man-made. It's a work of art. Now, art means two different things, especially historically. Now, when we use the word art, we typically mean something like the fine arts, so we associate it with beauty and things like that. And that's true. That is one aspect of man-made things. Works of art, things that are beautiful and delicate and just graceful and elegant. We call a dance a work of art. We call music a work of art, architecture, all of that. But there's another sense in which something is art too, and that's just the art of an artisan. Before we got industrialized and we had factories, we had things like guilds, where artists would produce shoes and carpentry and all that, right? They were artists, but their objective was not necessarily beauty, it was utility or use. You see that? So we naturally think of beauty when we think of art, but I just want to suggest to you that historically that wasn't always the case. The word art in the English vocabulary was also meant to capture what a carpenter would do. You know what I mean? What a carpenter would do, whoever designs these chairs would do. Definitely an architect, even if the architect wasn't aiming for beauty, if he designs a really good house that can house a family well, he was an artist. And what he made was artificial. It was a work of art. Okay, so let's go back to the watch. Can you just say a few things about the properties of the watch that make it artificial compared to the stone, which is just natural? I want to hear what you think. What is it about the watch that stands out? Go ahead. What? Complexity, very good. Absolutely. Now, that's definitely a step in the right direction, because simplicity, well, absolute simplicity, guys, like ultimate simplicity would be something like formlessness, right? If you want utter and complete simplicity, then take something that has no form at all, right? That's absolute simplicity. And that I would say, yeah, there's nothing remarkable about that. And I don't know whether physicists believe that exists. physicists tell us that the smallest particles are something like quarks or strings or something like that. I don't know. Are those things formless or not? I really don't know. I think it's a philosophical question. I know that in the history of philosophy, some philosophers have said that matter, the type of matter that God acted on when he created the world, that was formless. And even if you read the Bible, I think there's one way to interpret Genesis, the opening pages. God wasn't working with nothing. He was working with something very unformed, formless. And what he did is he was a great artist, and over the course of 6 or 7 days, he gave form to something formless. We're part of that. So complete formlessness, yeah, we are not likely to say that that needs a creator. Because even in the Bible, there's the void or the formless, whatever. And God didn't really create that according to the Bible. He found it, or it was already there, and he gave it shape. You see that? So complete formlessness, yeah, that probably is not artificial. But the moment we start having complexity, now it starts making us think, you know? But I wanna challenge you, Dante. Complexity is a step in the right direction, but it might not be sufficient simply because, don't you think we can find complexity in nature? I mean, look at us, multicellular organisms, right? Look at our form. Look at all the different systems we have. We've got a circulatory system. We've got a endocrine system for hormones. We've got a nervous system. We've got a digestive system. We've got a respiratory system. Each one of those systems is natural, but there's a lot of complexity. So complexity is at least more mysterious than simplicity, but there's something else. I want you to say a bit more about the complexity. If you look at all the systems I just named, they're complex, but there's something else. There's another group of words you need to associate with the complexity, and then you'll get us in the right direction. Go ahead.
Maybe that it's made for a specific purpose or use.
That's it. Do you see, Dante, what I was getting at? And did you ever hear that? Okay. Guys, do you see what's happening? Complexity is one thing, right? Complexity just means many aspects, something has many aspects or it's complicated. And that's kind of vague and abstract, right? Anything that's not simple is automatically complex, even if it's just a duality or whatever, right? Like you could say we are complex because we're both body and soul or body and mind. That means we're complex, not maximally complex, but you know, we're complex. We're not just body, we're not just mind, we're mind and body, okay? Now, what she said is very important. It's when you take the complexity and then you start to notice that the combination of the structure of the thing you're talking about with the different functions that the parts perform actually creates a kind of purpose or utility. Do you see that? When you take complexity, but it's organized into a structure, and that structure or organization seems functional, that is what now begins to make you say, look, man, there's something metaphysical about this object, right? You come across the stone, it's kind of like that formless matter. It's so simple that, yeah, probably that can exist by itself. But when you come across the watch, what Sarah said, it becomes true. There's many parts, and that's already dazzling, right? But when you notice that the structure, the parts of the structure are so well adapted to each other, there's a level of adaptation and subordination of different parts to each other. Everything is subservient, nothing is accidental, and those parts are functional. Each one is performing a role, and there's a net outcome or a net result, which is what? What does a watch do? It tells time. So guys, that's what William Paley is getting at. He's like, wait a minute. what we call observing something. There's observing something, then there's really observing something. If you just observe something and you never notice or have an intuition of just how functional the organization or the structure is, then yeah, you might say it's just complex, but it could have happened in nature. But once you actually observe something and you notice, oh my God, there's intricacy here. It's not just complexity, it's intricacy. Everything has been delicately well adapted to everything else, not in an arbitrary fashion, but so as to achieve some end of like telling time or something like that. So what he's saying is the world has a metaphysical feature. That is, the world is physical, it has appearances, but if you study it properly, it has metaphysical properties or non-physical properties. And the name William Paley gives to those non-physical properties is design. The world has evidence of design. Our bodies are like that watch. There's evidence of design in the watch, and there's evidence of design in our bodies. Some religious people would say there's evidence of design in the seasons. There's evidence of design in the solar system. When a star is born and when a star dies, black holes. Did you know that at the middle of all galaxies, there's a black hole? That's something I discovered late in life. I used to love astronomy, but I never knew that at the middle of every galaxy, and towards the center, there's a black hole. Now, what does a black hole do? Its gravity is so great that past a certain threshold, everything that goes in can never escape again. But if you remain outside that threshold, its gravity is still powerful enough to organize a galaxy. So once again, even at the galaxy level, we see structure. Even in our own bodies, we've got an anatomy and a physiology. All those systems I was telling you about. And then on the smallest scale, we've got DNA within our cells. And then if you go down into each particular atom, you find more structure, more function. Okay, so what are we talking about here? What's the logic? How do we design this argument? William Paley is saying this. The world is full of design. Wherever there is design, there must be a designer. Therefore, what? The world has a designer who we will call God. Guys, that's the basics. I mean, he walks through a couple of considerations that might challenge it, but that is the basics of what's going on. He says, look, one objection someone might give is, hey, you're talking about design. Did you ever see someone design DNA? Did you ever see someone design a solar system? He's saying that's one objection you could get. But he says that's not a real objection, because even we right now, there are plenty of fine arts that people practice that we never see them practicing it. We probably consume the product, but we never see the act of it being created. And we don't judge that a painting made itself just because we never saw the person who painted it, right? So he dismisses that kind of objection. Then there's another objection where he says, all right, some people might say, well, you know what? If the world has a designer, how come everything doesn't work perfectly, right? If he's such a great designer, doesn't that imply that the design must be so perfect that it never has a problem? The watch always tells time correctly. The human body should never break down, no disease, no disorders, nothing. He dismisses that again, and he says, look, that's irrelevant. No amount of error in the function or no amount of dysfunction in the object is evidence that there isn't design. The design would still be there, and there's a kind of burden, right? The burden is explaining the design. That burden persists regardless of the performance of the object you're studying. And then the last objection he looks at is just basically the objection that, look, here what's going on is that if you look at the human body or parts of nature, you might find parts, one, whose purpose you can't figure out immediately. So you might look at the human body and like, what is the spleen for? And what is this part of the large intestines for? You might not immediately be able to figure it out. Or you might find parts that perform no immediate function. So if you take away the part, you think it would still be able to function. And he once again dismisses those objections. He's like, look, you're not going to get away from the fact that even if you don't understand the machine perfectly, the burden of explaining the level of design you do see still persists. All right? All right, guys, thank you very much. We're just going to finish up with Leibniz next class, and then we're going to continue on with the mind-body problem. So on the syllabus for next class, make sure you read the Descartes, right? It's Descartes, Meditations 1 and 2. All right, we're going to end class here, and then I'll take attendance.